The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of 8 News Now or Nexstar Media Group.
Well, this week, Joe Biden, the former vice president, making his first campaign stop here since making his announcement he's running for president. It wasn't a very big crowd. He's leading the polls nationally. It was more of just a union event. Bradley, do you think that he's the front runner at this point in Nevada? Is that reflective of what we're seeing across the rest of the country?
Well, when you talk about Nevada, you're probably talking about the caucuses, being a favorite in Nevada. And a caucus requires an extraordinary organizational effort, very comprehensive. It really remains to be seen which of the myriad candidates can put together a team that can do those things. We're a long way out, so I think that the crowd sizes are interesting but not really reflective of much. If there is something about Joe Biden that is attractive to Nevadans, it's probably the same thing that appears to be attractive to people all over the country, which is he seems somehow less risky. So if you are in the market for a candidate who is better matched against the president, as opposed to a change candidate in and of his or herself, I would say he is the favorite.
What do you see just as the candidates are coming through, Alan? Now, can we name a favorite at this point here?
Well, it's tough. I would agree in some ways. You know, he's a little more of a safe candidate at this point. But Biden also, he's not an exciting guy. Whether you like him or not, I don't care. He's not an exciting guy. He doesn't bring big crowds wherever he goes. He's not a Trump. Even Bernie Sanders brings out more people than
Sure.
Biden does. He's more exciting. You know, he's more animated. Kamala Harris the same way, if I put that. But Biden is the choice he's offering is the moderate candidate. Klobuchar is trying to become that also, but I don't think she has a prayer, and she's not as established as he is after all these years. So, and the fact that he is flawed a little bit, I think actually works in his favor. I mean, look at Trump was flawed in many ways and got elected presidency.
One or two.
So, it's true. But I mean, people saw him as being human, very human, and I think that Biden has that quality as well, just because he has had accusations. I mean, if I were him, I would have gone forward and said, yeah, I hugged him, and so what? But, it's the apology type thing. In this state right now, it's up for grabs. You've got 21 people, I think, Democrats that have announced. You've probably got several more in the wings waiting, and so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with any so-called debates with the groups that they're going to have. And I will know more probably by November, December, before the end of the year.
Talking about the moderate choice, I did ask him after the event, I asked the former vice president, does that concern you trying to get through a primary? I know you think you're the best candidate in the general, but do you have concerns in the primary? Of course, he says, no, he does not have concerns. Should he have concerns?
Well, any candidate facing a field of that size is going to have to navigate untold numbers of events and crises and moments that are completely unforeseen at the moment. Anytime you are going through that many people, there will have to be, adaptations on the fly, which he doesn't know, and no one will, be able to predict. So, yes, every candidate should be concerned with the road ahead of them.
And like you said a minute ago also, we don't have a primary here, a presidential primary.
It's a
caucus, and that's going to be different because the people who want to organize for certain candidates in that caucus are probably going to be more for other candidates than Biden. The party has gone more left than it has in the past, and he's trying to still position himself as progressive, but still more moderately progressive. So I would agree. I think the caucus factor here is going to make a difference.
And let's also remember that the Nevada caucus process isn't just a single-day event. It's precincts, then a month later the county caucuses, and then a month after that the state convention. And if you recall, Secretary Clinton won on caucus day here. Senator Sanders was able to prevail at the county level, and then Secretary Clinton again was able to reverse that at the state level, so that even the results on caucus day won't necessarily tell the tale of who gets the delegates. And in the end, it's about who gets delegates to be on the stage at the end of the day.
Let's talk a little bit about a state issue when we talk education funding. So the teachers here in Southern Nevada are seriously considering going on strike. There's an ongoing vote that by the time this airs will wrap up tonight, if we're looking at it that way. Who does anybody look bad, or who looks bad when the teachers go on strike, if that is to happen?
Well, it is hard for me at the moment to judge the seriousness of this effort. We're obviously in the midst of a legislative session that it's nearing its climax. I won't say its completion, because that's never a certain thing. So right now, I see it as a ploy to get things done during this session. If it maintains after that and into the summer, the notion of whether it will hurt the governor or not, or will hurt legislators, it still remains to be seen, because whose feet can you really lay something like that at? It would be extraordinary in Nevada for teachers to go on strike. I won't say it's impossible. We all know that it is unlawful. That doesn't mean it's impossible. Sometimes people do unlawful things knowing the consequences and decide to do them anyway. That may happen here. I think it would be, if not unprecedented, I'm not aware of any previous instance of this. I don't know who would be hurt by this. It is too early in the Sisolak administration to talk about what it would do to the governor's legacy going forward. He's still building a track record as opposed to a legacy. So we'll see on that, but there's a long way to go until school starts in late August to know anything about it, really.
Well, and the interesting thing, the whole law went into effect 1969 is when it went on the Nevada Revised Statutes, which was after a Clark County teacher strike. So it's been 50 years, which is interesting. But you also bring up the point about not being, it's not legal, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. We've seen places like Arizona also where teachers went on strike. They got a 20% raise over 3 years. So I think obviously the power, if the power or the willpower is there to do it, they could do it, right? But Alan, what do you think? Just the fact that this is within the first 6 months of Governor Sisolak's administration, there are concerns whether or not enough funding will be there to fulfill promises. Do you have concerns on that end?
Well, first of all, I agree with you on one big point, and that is that I think it's a ploy at this point. I mean, it is, obviously. Yeah, right now it is, because they're not on strike yet, and no raises come through yet, so it's kind of a pressure point. So that is a fact. It is a ploy. If they go on strike because they don't get the raise that was promised them by Sisolak in the State of the State address, then there's a blotch on his governorship, his tenure as governor, absolutely, because he will have failed to come through for part of his constituency, one. Number two, it'll be a huge blotch, I believe, on the teachers union, and by extension teachers as well, public school teachers, because what they would be saying is, in fact, yes, people break the law within the understanding that I'll pay the consequences, but what they're saying and what the message they're giving to students is, and everyone else, is if you want something bad enough and you have to break the law for it, it's okay to do it as long as you're getting rewarded for it. They will break the law by having the strike if they do that, and they'll be rewarded financially, theoretically. And of course, that tells anybody, you want to go in and stick up a liquor store or rob a bank. It's against the law, but are you going to benefit from it financially? Well, yes, I will. Well, hell, the teachers are doing it. I mean, why shouldn't I? It may not seem the same in terms of the seriousness, no guns involved or anything like that, but the idea that you can break the law in order to benefit yourself financially is a message that's going to be sent out. I think it's a horrendous message. I think it is. It's the wrong message for teachers of all people to do. And again, I know the union is pushing, it's pushing the teachers to want to do this, but geez, Louis, I would hope that the teachers would resist the union, and if they don't, it's going to be a blotch on them as well as the governor.
Well, I would dispute the analogy, analogizing a teacher strike or any sort of strike to a stick-up. I think is a bit of a reach. When you look at teachers as workers, and Alan, when you say especially teachers, I understand they fulfill a specific and important role within our society. We expect them to teach our children. But as workers, no one enters into a strike lightly. It means going without pay. It means relying upon, if you have a strike fund, relying upon each other. It's also an organizational effort that is highly consequential. So I would trust the teachers to make a responsible decision and to only go on strike and to put the school year at risk if that was truly all they could do to make headway on the things that they truly need. I don't think they're being unreasonable. They're not asking for, golden schools and extra cars and free things. They're asking for things that they feel they've been promised over the years. So I don't know whether it would be a blotch on the governor, because he's coming in at the end of a 50-year cycle of our schools in this state heading downward toward the bottom of national rankings. Would it show that it couldn't be solved this session? Absolutely. Would it mean that it can't be solved? I don't think so.
But one thing I want to respond to is that the analogy that I use, the point is that breaking the law is okay as long as I can benefit from it. And that is a message, that will be the message, that the fact that if I want something bad enough, even though it entails breaking the law, knowing there will be consequences, but if I break the law, and the consequence here would be that I get rewarded for it by getting money for it, that's a hell of a message to send out to students in particular. And that's why I think it would be a blotch in that. No, it's not the same as, and my example was extreme, sticking up a liquor store, and I said without guns or anything like that with the teachers, but they are breaking the law, and breaking the law so you can benefit from it is against the law. I mean, you understand that as an attorney.
Certainly, but
and by the way, the blotch I think will be on Sisolak only because he made that promise. Now, if he said at the State of the State, we're going to do what we can, we're going to work with them. If we can get it through this session, fine. If not, we'll do it next session. But we're going to begin the process. We'll see what we can do. But he made a promise, and all those people in the whole auditorium stood up, and they were going mad, applauding him for it. So it's a commitment he made. Will he follow through with it? I mean, we'll wait and see.
Sure, but if we want to discuss, lawlessness for the purposes of personal or political benefit, we can certainly get into an awful lot of examples of those, both on a state and a national level. Recently, it's when a teachers union, and I believe teachers take their jobs very, very seriously. It's a passion for them, or else they wouldn't work as hard as they do, put their own money into their classrooms, work for the salaries they work for. They wouldn't do those things if they didn't love what they were doing. I have to think that they wouldn't take this step if it weren't to them entirely necessary. So, we can agree to disagree on that particular.
Okay, we will agree to disagree. I think they may think it's necessary, but nonetheless, it is breaking the law. When I grew up, by the way, teachers, a while ago when I grew up, teachers did not make a whole lot of money. A matter of fact, they were like at the bottom of the ranking. People in those days, you wanted to be something big, become an engineer. They said you can make yourself $9,500 a year. I kid you not. Teachers didn't make a whole lot, but they were out there working because they were dedicated. Just like you say, I agree with you. But they were not going on strike. They were making what they made. They understood it. Sometimes they had to have summer jobs. Their spouse sometimes had to work part-time, whatever. But they did. But it was a calling for them, as you indicated. But they knew teachers are not going to be paid what other professions are. 9-month-a-year job as well, with all due respect. I appreciate what they're doing, but you've got to look at the totality of it.
Sure, but a calling, sometimes people rely on the fact that it's a calling to exploit individuals, and there is a limit to which even someone who has a calling, who is still a worker, will agree to their own exploitation or broken promises, or the diminution of the education budget in this state and elsewhere across this country. I think there's a limit. So in the end, I'm going to trust their decision to do what's right for their particular circumstances here.
Well, let's, given the situation that we're talking about in Carson City and talking about the money, a rollback is underway to try to get prevailing wage back into construction contracts for things like schools and other buildings that you could see the school district would put underway. Is this the right time to do that, assuming that's going to go forward? I'll start with you on this one, Alan. Is this the right time, if it is going to happen, to roll back those restrictions on prevailing wage?
No, absolutely not. I mean, right now we've got a budgetary problem in this state. We have promises and expenditures that are going to be expected to be approved, supposedly, we'll see in the next few weeks, And yet we don't have the money for all this stuff. We talked about the teachers a minute ago. I mean, in the raises. I mean, there are a lot of things we don't have the money for. And another thing the governor promised was he was not going to raise any taxes. Now, some people do believe that the fact that he's extending taxes in areas where they were supposed to have been sunsetted and died, it's raising taxes. But he's extending them nonetheless, and he's promised no additional taxes are going to be instituted. So I don't know where they're going to find the funds, where they're going to find the money to pay for all of this stuff. And I think that is a serious discussion they ought to have before they talk about rolling back anything or changing the structure of the state or raises for teachers or anyone else for that matter. I'm not sure that the governor is getting as good of advice as he could be getting from his financial advisors. I like him personally. He's a smart guy, did well as the head of the Clark County Commission here, but I don't think he's getting very good advice up north.
This is the first session since that was put into play where Democrats control the executive and the legislative, therefore have the opportunity to roll this back. But the same question, is this the right time considering the circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time within 20 years that the Democrats have had the governor's mansion. Is it the right time? You know, let's talk about prevailing wage in the context of what's happened to it for schools and public projects. This isn't some long-standing precedent that's going to be rolled back in some revolution. This is only a 4-year-old cut. Really, it was 2015 that prevailing wage was sort of pulled out of public works and out of the school district. So it's not that there has never been money for that and there never will be. This is a social choice, right? I mean, if you permit the prevailing wage for public schools, I mean, what you're saying is it's good enough to build your casinos. It's good enough to build everything else. You want those casinos and everything else to be the best it can be. If we believe that higher wages incentivizes better workers, why wouldn't we want to build the best possible schools? So in my mind, the notion of whether it's a good time right now to do that is a bit like raising the minimum wage or raising taxes. Right? You can't raise taxes in bad times because everyone's struggling. You can't raise taxes in good times because you'll dampen the enthusiasm. Apparently there's no good time to raise taxes. There's no good time to raise the minimum wage. There is no good time to address these things. It's always a good time to address these things.
I agree. There's no good time to raise taxes, by the way.
I thought you
believe me, there's no good time to raise taxes. The issue of prevailing wage just does not apply to the construction of schools, although I agree it does involve that, but in other areas as well. And again, they're going to have to make a decision up north about where this money is going to come from. It's not magic. I mean, they're not appearing on the strip, like at a David Copperfield show. I mean, they're not doing that. I mean, they've got to actually come up with some concrete ideas about where they're going to get this money. And right now, I don't think they have the idea where they're going to get it. And I put that back once again to the fact that I don't think the governor's getting good financial advice by his advisors. A nice guy, well-intentioned, but I think that the people around him are not doing him the service that they need to do. And I think that's going to be a problem. Well, I mean, wait and see. But given the fact that they don't have the money right now, no, they should not be rolling back the prevailing wage.
Gave Alan the first word on this one. Last word if you want it.
Well, it seems to me that much like the minimum wage debate, one thing that's always left out is that incrementally more money in the pockets of those people who need to spend it, right? Whether it's on rent or to buy a car or to buy a house, right? Will redound to the benefit of the state in tax revenue in other ways. Maybe those people will buy houses and pay property taxes. Maybe they'll buy more things because they need to, because they live closer to the margins than the individuals who would invest it or send it to some offshore account or something of that nature. So there are aspects to this debate that don't always make it into the heart of it, which is we're talking about people's wages, right? We're talking about workers, paying them the prevailing wage in this instance. There's no real reason to leave schools and public works out of it, especially if you're putting in the context of the debate over public sector unions generally and collective bargaining for those individuals. Those people are workers like any others, and I think they should be given the same opportunities and the same benefits as private sector workers.
You said something, so I'm going to extend it now. I wasn't going to say the final word, but you said something that was interesting. In a way, you almost said it was a form of trickle-down economics in a sense, because
I wouldn't use that particular phrase.
I know, but I would. I see.
Trickle-down economics means I give the CEO more money, he spends it, and it gets down to me. This is giving it to me, and I will spend. That's right. That's a very different proposition.
Insofar as, is that an economic kickstart?
Well, all right. I wasn't going to comment, but as long as you did, I get the chance to say this. The idea of a minimum wage, because you brought up minimum wage, the idea of minimum wage certainly, I think, is a mistaken concept in a lot of ways. Yes, you may give an individual more money who may be able to do more things, as you're suggesting. It will eliminate a lot of starter jobs, number one. Number two, another issue is that instead of employing more people in starter positions, people would be, owners of businesses would be forced to cut their labor force. Huge cut in the labor force in New York when they instituted that after the 1st of January this past year. I mean, a ton of people were let go. Others, restaurants started saying things like, you've got to seat yourself. I mean, that sense of coming into a restaurant and having certain types of things given to you that you've been used to have begun to change. We've had layoffs, we know, in Washington State, where they had minimum wage addressed as well. In other states, I'm not saying minimum wage should never be raised, but they've always been raised incrementally and with a small number. The way people are talking about it these days, they want to go from 7 to 15, and other people are. I've literally read. We were in Hawaii last year, and they were talking about, well, why not $20 to $25 minimum wage per hour? There were articles on this in the local paper. They're actually saying this. So I mean, and of course I'm saying, well, hell, let's go to 50 or let's go to 100. I mean, why keep it a low number? Let's just really give it to them, you know. And then you'll have lots of restaurants will close, and lots of businesses, and then you'll have fewer people working, and then we'll be in a real problem. So I mean, there are different ways to look at what a minimum wage can do. An individual will have more to spend, that's true, but also fewer people will be working in those startup positions. And that's a concern for me, especially for kids who depend on summer jobs and after school jobs during the year.
Well, those are, you'll forgive my pun, those are fairly stock responses, both literally and figuratively, Mr. Stock. But there is I'm surprised you didn't add the sort of third to the sort of trinity, which is the automation threat. You know, there's these
happening now anyway.
These jobs are for kids, over summer, don't raise the wage. Everyone's going to lose their job, don't raise the wage. Or if you do raise the wage, we're going to replace you with a robot. All right? On the third one, I'll say this. As you say, that's happening anyway. That's right. That happens based on particular decisions and the ability of a business owner to do that. If it's profitable, they're going to do that whether or not you ask for the raise or not. Nobody,
absolutely.
There's, you go to the grocery store, you go to the bank, right? There was no nationwide strike of grocery store cashiers. That happened because they could afford to do it. Long-term business owners made money. That's going to happen anyway, and we're going to have to deal with that in our economy, regardless of what the minimum wage is. And I'm happy to talk about levels of minimum wage. You know what the proposal here is in Nevada. It looks like $12, right, over a 5-year ramp up. So an incremental raise is apparently on the horizon, and hopefully the consequences you're talking about will be able to be dealt with incrementally over time as people adjust to that. But with more money in people's pockets, hopefully they'll be spending this money. They'll need places to spend that money. There will be businesses that will be responsive to people wanting to spend their money. So
by the way, I agree with you on the automation, and I'm not crazy about a lot of it, but the reality is that it's here and it's happening, and it is going to affect people's jobs. I mean, we go to the supermarket like you do, and if I go into the self-help line and run through it myself. I agree. I mean, that's happening. Not good, but it's like fighting the future.
It's inevitable.
That's inevitable.
Well, should Attorney General Barr be held in contempt of Congress? We'll just keep it a nice, simple question.
Should is a different question. I mean, look, anyone who defies a lawful subpoena should expect that the next thing that's going to happen to them is they're going to be held in contempt. Now, holding Attorney General Barr in contempt is one very small step. What matters is what happens with the contempt charge, right? If anyone's going to do anything about it, then we'll have a real discussion. The mere fact of holding the Attorney General in contempt, just as it was for the previous Attorney General, is really not that big a deal. It's a political maneuver. The point is where it leads. Now, for the normal person, being held in contempt can have tremendous consequences. Some people may not remember the name Susan McDougal, who in the Whitewater years during the Starr investigation spent 22 months in jail for contempt, for refusing to answer questions in a grand jury. So there can be, under the right circumstances, tremendous consequences for someone's life for being held in contempt if someone takes the next step, if law enforcement or the courts or Congress in this instance take the next step. That's what I think is so highly unlikely that this will, though I think if you defy a lawful subpoena, you should be held in contempt. This will devolve into some sort of theater, because without the political will to do the next thing, whatever that next thing is, it really doesn't matter.
I suspect you might agree somewhat with that. Is this much more than theater?
No, it is political theater, and it's posturing and everything else. But what's also going on here is the fact that the Democrats negotiated with Barr for 1 week. And now they want, all of a sudden, they want to issue this order. Listen, Eric Holder went through this, as you mentioned, in the prior administration, but Republicans negotiated with him for 8 months. I mean, so I mean, there was more of a give and take, and more of a resistance to go the full way. And eventually, of course, it was overturned by the courts holders, and so I don't think this is going anywhere at all. I mean, we're in a position right now where we see the Democrats are in charge of the House. They said they were going to come in there, and you can look at Pelosi's tapes from those days. As soon as they got elected, we're going to go in there, we're going to deal with Medicare, we're going to deal with the health, we're going to deal with all kinds of things. And the only thing they've really dealt with is this continuing investigation into the Mueller the Mueller probe. And they knew were going to get something. There was collusion. There was all kinds of stuff going on. And then it comes out that there was none of that going on whatsoever. And now they're going, we got to keep, hammering away anyway at something like this. Listen, after Donald Trump is reelected for a second term, they're going to continue hammering away at him for the remaining 4 years that he'll have once he's reelected. I mean, they hate his guts. And of course, he throws red meat to them by his tweeting and by the things that he says. It's a duke out. This is what's actually going on over there right now. It's political posturing, and the only thing I can say is wait and see what happens after the election a year from November. It's going to be fascinating to see not only who's in the White House, although I believe Trump will win, but who's going to be controlling Congress. And I think that's the important question.
Well, then you throw the whole executive privilege side into it as well, and that just continues to fire up the bases on both sides.
Yeah, and I found that particular assertion of executive privilege to be rather curious. I mean, executive privilege is sort of normally used in a very specific manner for particular pieces of evidence or information. This was sort of a blanket executive privilege after the report had already been released. I don't really know that there's much basis for it. I think it also falls into the category of posturing and theater. Now, eventually all of this is going to come to a head in some courtroom somewhere. And many of the assertions by the Trump administration, for example, Secretary Mnuchin's refusal to release tax returns, those are going to come to a head because there are set ways in which you deal with these things. You follow the law, and then you go get an injunction, right? And the law says if Congress asks for this, you give them to them. It says shall. There's no way you can say, I don't think you want this for the right reasons. That's for an impartial arbiter, a court, to deal with. But all of these things will come to a head at some point. Whether they will happen prior to the 2020 election, I think that's part of the gambit. You can stretch these things out for a very long time, years sometimes. So we may not know the answer to any of these questions, and I think that's part of the strategy, is that if these questions are hanging up in the air, the administration gets to act as if they are being defiant without the ultimate consequences happening prior to next November, which I think would be a boon to them, as opposed to, by the end of the summer or the start of next year, this sort of privileged house of cards starting to fall. That would be more damaging to the president. But I think with the appellate process and everything, you could stretch this out for a long time. I think that's part of the play.
Yeah, and I think you would agree that's kind of what's everybody's banking on in the administration.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, going after these tax records is a fishing expedition, and it's part of this whole thing to bring the president down and those around him and everything else. listen, I think that the president has every right to initiate executive privilege. All presidents, just about all presidents, have done it at one time or another, and some with more frequency than others. And I think that Donald Trump is doing the right thing by standing by his executive orders. I think that and every time he does that, and every time that he says no, they just get more. The Democrats and Nadler and all of these, they can see them. They get on TV and their faces are puffing out and they're red and they don't know what to do. But again, it goes back to the fact that they never accepted the fact that he won the presidency. And people like Maxine Waters and others, Swalwell, if you want to throw him in, and some others, have been talking about impeaching him. I mean, Swalwell and Schiff, remember, saw evidence of collusion, that he got together with Putin and they did all this collusion. Well, it was never true. It was a complete lie, totally made up. And once the Mueller report came out, which, by the way, the whole thing has come out, and only redacted portions are there because of the legal angles regarding not putting out certain in private or privy information. But they went ahead and they still insisted, Schiff and Swalwell, I'm talking about, that no, he absolutely, there's still collusion involved. So I mean, that's why they're continuing all of this. It's amazing to watch. They've made a huge mistake. Democrats have made a huge mistake because if they had gone out and tried to really accomplish things, and then Republicans said no, and they became obstructionists, Democrats would look very good then, I think, in the eyes of the country. But instead, they've gone after this very infantile concept of going after the president, refusing to accept the Mueller report, wanting everything redacted, even though it's against the law to release certain information. So, I mean, the administration is abiding by the law by refusing to comply with these requests. They made a huge mistake. I mean, for me, politically, I'm glad. Don't misunderstand me. But on an objective note, they could have taken the high road, so to speak, and it would have been a much more of a benefit for them.
Well, I will say that after what I witnessed for 8 years under President Obama, I don't necessarily believe that Republicans think that obstruction hurts them in a legislative world. In fact, when you're the party of no government or less government, it is much easier to stop things from happening than to permit them to happen. So stalemates work in the Republicans' favor, right? Especially those libertarian Republicans who wish that the government were, merely an army and nothing more. As far as the Mueller report, I mean, it's very clear what is written in black and white. Special Counsel Mueller found no evidence of a criminal conspiracy. Absolutely true. He found very clear evidence of obstruction of justice by the president and said, because I can't indict. I mean, it's as if he were presenting to a grand jury. The grand jury in this instance, as he put it, is Congress. It is Congress's prerogative to deal with the evidence he put forward. And he listed numerous instances where all the elements of obstruction of justice were met. In his mind, he did his job and is now leaving it to the people whose job it is to go forward with what would be essentially impeachment would be a type of indictment here, right? And then the trial would be in the Senate. I'm not going to fault anyone for saying we're not done here when the evidence says all the elements of obstruction of justice have been met by the president for this, and this, right? How could anyone say, well, we're done here, case closed? That's simply not how justice works. Now, do I wish it weren't happening in the midst of a presidential campaign, so that particular aspect of it were not the focal point? Should we impeach? Should we not impeach? What's it going to do to our chances? Who's going to do better? Who's going to be hurt by impeachment? I wish we were merely looking at the evidence and like following that to its logical conclusion. I mean, that is difficult in a congressional situation, and impeachment is a huge step. Right? And I wish we would remember that.
Real quick, I just want to say, I agree about the obstruction. Republicans did obstruct during the Obama administration. We wore that badge proudly, I might add. So I'm just saying that in fact happened. The issue about whether or not they will try to impeach, I say go ahead and go for it. Go for it, because I remember what happened after they went ahead and impeached Bill Clinton, and they couldn't convict him in the Senate. You know what happened after that in the election? Democrats were the ones who actually gained more seats in Congress as a result of those shenanigans that went on with Republicans at the time. So yes, if Democrats want to go ahead and initiate impeachment and put it before the Senate and during this election period, God bless him. Let him go ahead and do it.
I've
because
got to initiate the end of the show here because we're up against a time wall. But I thank you both for coming in this week.
it's been terrific. Thank you.